Meeting postponed. The White House announcing yesterday that President Trump will not be meeting with Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein until next week. This, as Fox is just confirming, conservative GOP leaders in the House have reached a deal to bring in Rosenstein for a closed-door session meeting to discuss the New York Times story about potentially recording the president and invoking the 25th Amendment to remove President Trump. It is not clear, however, if Rosenstein will respond to that congressional request. Joining us right now is former White House press secretary under President Trump, senior advisor and spokesperson for America First Action PAC, and the author of The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President, Sean Spicer. Sean, it's great to see you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
You bet. Good morning.
Your take on President Trump's meeting with his Deputy Attorney General?
I think it's an important meeting. Obviously, you need to make sure that there's a chemistry and a relationship and a degree of trust by those you appoint, and those are executing important duties throughout your administration. But the president rightly postponed this in light of the other news that's going on with respect to the Supreme Court. But, you know, look, I think that there's a lot about how this thing went down in terms of the reporting of it, whether it happened at all, whether it was a joke, an offhanded comment that was taken out of context. And I think the president needs to sit down, as he's going to do with Mr. Rosenstein, and say, explain yourself to me. What happened? What did you mean? Did it really happen? And there's a lot of extremes that go into that question. Either it really didn't happen or it did happen. And if it did happen, was he joking around? And, you know, what was the context in which it was said?
Yeah, I know, but there's more to it, right, Sean? I mean, Rod Rosenstein was the one who signed off on the third FISA warrant to wiretap Carter Page. He wrote a letter to fire Jim Comey and then was upset with the president when the president said that's one of the reasons why he fired him. And, of course, he's been sitting on documents that Congress wants to investigate how they came up with this narrative that Trump had anything to do with the Russia meddling.
Right. And I think I go back to what I said initially, Maria, which is, look, these are people that have been appointed by the President of the United States to serve in his administration. He was elected by the American people. And that if these people don't feel comfortable with the policies and agenda that he has, then they have an obligation to resign. And so I think the president needs to be able to look, in this case, Mr. Rosenstein in the eye and say, explain yourself to me. If you're not doing what I have asked you to do, in terms of the Department of Justice and the actions and policies that I want implemented, then you need to go. You should not be undermining me or opposing this agenda in any way, shape, or form. And so that's a conversation that the two of them need to have. But as you mentioned, all those aforementioned issues are important. And I think we need to make it clear that these aren't independent agencies that can go do whatever they want. They are appointed to serve and execute the policies and agenda of the President of the United States.
Sean, it's Liz Peek. Good morning. It does seem to me that the president is somewhat boxed in. In other words, this has been an incredibly compromising news story about Rosenstein. The question is, if he gets rid of Rosenstein, who is next? I mean, is there a succession possibility here that's going to satisfy supporters of President Trump?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's the president selects those individuals, so I don't know that they have a succession plan in place right now, but I'm sure that there's a ton of qualified individuals either within the department that could be elevated and nominated to that position. Noel Fonseca, who's the current Solicitor General, I think by statute and order would take over certain aspects of the job. But I think there's a fundamental threshold question that needs to get asked first, which is, you know, whether or not the aspects of this New York Times story were accurate in the first place. So I'm less worried about the replacement than I am about the nut of the story. And as I mentioned at the outset, I think there's a big difference between whether it happened at all and then sort of the degrees. If it happened, was it an offhanded joke that is trying to make Mr. Rosenstein look bad in the eyes of the president, knowing that something like this might tick him off? So I think first and foremost, before we start talking about replacements, we need to understand the context of the story and whether or not any of the aspects are true.
Mm. Yep, it's a good point. We want to turn to the House Judiciary Committee. House Judiciary Chairman Bob Goodlatte issued a subpoena for the memos related to the former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. The so-called McCabe memo is writing to Attorney General Jeff Sessions this: given the department's ongoing delays and/or refusal to produce these documents, I'm left with no choice but to issue the enclosed subpoena to compel their production. What effect is this going to have, do you think? We've seen subpoenas before. Are we going to see these memos?
Well, I hope so. Look, we're not talking about necessarily putting them out in the public domain, but the members have a right, a constitutional right to oversight And the idea that a Republican House is being stymied by a Republican-run Department of Justice is a little mind-boggling. So I don't know why it's taking Chairman Goodlatte to go to the length of a subpoena. They should be able to come to terms privately and meet in closed session or however, whatever form is appropriate to review these things. But this is somewhat out of norm that you have the same party having this discussion. So I think I would behoove the Department of Justice to work with Chairman Goodlatte and the Republican leadership in the House to satisfy these requests.
Yeah, maybe they just don't want to see what's in these memos, right? Because what did Trey Gowdy say, Dagan? That it's an embarrassment because we're going to actually see how they came up with this idea that Trump had anything to do with the Russia scandal.
An embarrassment to John Brennan, I think.
Yeah,
Called
John
Brennan
Brennan.
out.
Well,
He said that
and-
he didn't think that there was anything new in there for the most part. That's not going to any kind of great shockers in the memos.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I would add in this is that for all these people who constantly are crying about transparency, here we have another instance of trying to get more information to understand what's really going on. And it seems that so many people are actually trying to prevent us from having a greater understanding of what's really going on. For all those people who care about Russia and this collusion, well, here's another way to find out what's at the basis of this. What is that information? And we're not talking about putting it out publicly. It's members of Congress exercising their constitutional responsibility.
And this speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Right.